Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, and welcome to this RCPCH webinar on Immunisation is Everyone's Business. Today's webinar will be delivered by Professor Helen Bedford, who is Professor of Children's Health at UCL Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health, and Dr. David Ellerman, who is a consultant in community child health at Great Ormond Street Hospital. The presentation will last for between 30 to 45 minutes. Following this, we'll have a Q&A session until we close the webinar at 1 o'clock. If anybody would like to ask questions, they are requested to submit through the webinars tab, through the questions tab on the webinar on their screens, and we'll take questions at the end of the presentation. You can ask repeated questions if you like, but bearing in mind we only have sufficient time to answer some of those questions before the end of the webinar. For those people that have colleagues who weren't able to join us today, the webinar will be recorded and made available on the college's Compass Learning Management System in about a week's time. So without further ado, I'll now hand over to Helen to start the presentation.
Hello. In this webinar, we're going to take a brief look at the current immunisation schedule for children and adolescents. We're going to focus on MMR and influenza, consider vaccines for vulnerable children, and then consider the principles of talking to parents about immunisation. So immunisation is acknowledged as being the most effective medical intervention, and after clean water, the most effective public health intervention in protecting health. And the power of vaccines is demonstrated by the global eradication of smallpox in 1980, and polio is next on the list for global eradication, with only 33 wild cases last year in the 3 remaining endemic countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria. However, improvements could be made, and although there are many new vaccines available, the greatest benefit to children's health globally would be to ensure that more children are protected with existing vaccines. In 2017, over 100,000 children died from measles, and in the hour that we're on this webinar, an average of about 12 children would die from this infection, for which there's a highly effective and safe vaccine. Nevertheless, there have been huge reductions in measles cases. So since the turn of the century, measles vaccine is estimated to have prevented 20 million deaths globally. But despite these major successes, we've seen a re-emergence of measles recently. So in this webinar, we're going to explore the important role that health professionals have as advocates for immunisation, both for individual patients and the population in general. So first, to take a look at the routine schedule. Vaccines are offered against 13 diseases by the age of 13 months, with a further 4 or 5, depending whether you're a boy or a girl, by the age of 18 years. And the schedule changes frequently, with the most recent changes were the introduction of Hep B vaccine for all infants from 2017. But it's important to remember that babies who are at particularly high risk of Hep B by virtue of their mother's infectious status still get these additional doses here. Changes that are soon to come in include the possibility of a change to the schedule for pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, reducing the current 2 doses to 1, and the introduction of HPV vaccine for teenage boys from September 2019. There's no catch-up program coming in. Now to focus in a bit more detail on measles. This slide shows measles notifications from 1950 up to 2010, and you can see very clearly the epidemic cycles with in a peak year up to 600, 700,000 notifications of measles. Measles vaccine, single measles vaccine came in 50 years ago in 1968, and that brought down the size of the epidemics and spaced them out. But vaccine uptake was poor for a while because it wasn't like now where we have these highly organised vaccine programs, but it gradually went up. An MMR vaccine was introduced 30 years ago with the aim of eliminating these 3 infections. Vaccine uptake went up to 90%, and it was 90% throughout the late 90s and 2000s, and that brought down the size measles cases very dramatically. Just a reminder about the complications of measles. So complications occur in about 1 in 15 cases. These include convulsions, otitis media, pneumonia, encephalitis, ITP. SSP, which is a rare, late, fatal complication of measles, is uncommon. It occurs at a rate of about 4 in 100,000 cases, but it's important to remember that there's a much increased risk of SSP in children who have the disease under the age of 1, and of course we don't immunize those children, so they are dependent on herd immunity. If you go to the Oxford Knowledge Project, which is a website by the Oxford Vaccine Group, there's a film there of a mother describing her daughter's experience. She had measles as a very young child, too young to be immunized, and then 2 decades later developed SSP. There's also a lot of very other useful information on that website. So let's just remind ourselves of the adverse effects of MMR vaccine. So with any vaccine given by injection, there will be soreness, redness and swelling soon after. And then mild measles, which often occurs with a rash, can occur about a week after the vaccine. Now this is not transmissible, so children can't pass it on. Fever in about 1 in 15, and then a mild mumps where you can see parotid swelling at about 21 days. Febrile convulsions occur in about 1 in 3,000. All the adverse effects of MMR vaccine are much lower than with the complications of the disease. So as MMR contains live attenuated viruses, these adverse effects are all biologically plausible. Just over 21 years ago, a paper was published in The Lancet which described 12 children with autism or regressive developmental disorder and bowel symptoms. And in 8, it was reported that the behavioural symptoms came on soon after MMR vaccine at a mean interval of about 6.3 days. In some children they were reported to literally come on overnight. The paper concluded we did not prove an association between measles, mumps and rubella vaccine and the syndrome described, but suggested there was a need for further research. The lead author announced at a press conference that measles, mumps and rubella vaccines should be given separately at yearly intervals, while other authors on the paper strongly supported the continued use of MMR vaccine. But the paper was interpreted widely as showing a link with autism, bowel problems and the vaccine, and the lead author indeed continues to publicise this. In subsequent years, there was a lot of publicity given to this, which peaked in about 2002. And unsurprisingly, many parents decided they didn't want their children to have MMR vaccine. And uptake fell in England and Wales. Uptake of the vaccine fell in England and Wales to below 80%, though interestingly, not so low in Scotland. But this is low enough, given the infectivity of measles, this is low enough to be problematic because you need very high rates of MMR to have herd immunity to measles. In February 2010, The Lancet retracted the paper after Andrew Wakefield was found guilty by the GMC of ethical and financial irregularities, and he and another colleague were struck off the medical register later that year. Now, unlike the adverse events of MMR that we reviewed earlier, the features of autism don't follow postnatal measles, mumps or rubella unless accompanied by a severe encephalitis. So for this reason, prior to the MMR introduction, no studies had been carried out specifically looking for autism after administration of the vaccine, and no significant concerns have been raised in this respect in the 16 years of use in the USA before it was introduced into the UK. Since the publication, the Lancet publication 21 years ago, there has been a significant body of research conducted, and there now are over 140 sound scientific studies finding no link between MMR vaccine and autism and bowel disease. The most recent was published just 2 days ago on March the 4th, and it includes over 650,000 children in Denmark, over 6,000 of whom had a diagnosis of autism. The study found no link between autism and MMR vaccine, even in susceptible children, and is not associated with clustering of autism cases after vaccination. Because of the reduced vaccine uptake that followed the publication of the Lancet, measles became re-established in this country, in England, in about 2006-2007. Various MMR catch-up campaigns followed, which kept measles down in various years. But last year, in 2018, there were almost 1,000 laboratory-confirmed cases in England. And the recent measles epidemic has changed somewhat in that the main burden of disease has moved from younger age groups to those over 15 years of age. Rates of disease remain highest in infants under the age of 1, but we see a lot more disease in these older individuals who weren't immunized when they were young. The high hospitalization rates of over 30% reflect the disease in older individuals who have a more severe measles. Over 90% of the cases were unimmunized, and we've seen importations from Europe. And these outbreaks have been linked to large public events such as music festivals. Recently, 98% of countries have reported increases in measles, with 10 countries accounting for almost 3/4 of the total increase, and several others that had previously been declared measles-free have seen measles re-emerge. In Europe last year, in 2018, there were 80,000 cases and 70 deaths. Although much recent publicity has focused on the anti-vaccine movements, and in particular the increase in anti-vaccine sentiment on social media, the increases are due to multiple causes and differ in different countries and can't all be put at the door of the anti-vaccine movement. For example, in some countries there's been political unrest, a lack of government support for vaccine programs, underfunding, vaccine shortages, or in other countries which have had low uptake for many years, this has resulted in a pool of susceptible people. In the USA, where measles was eliminated in 2000, recent outbreaks have all been triggered by importations into areas with pockets of susceptibility because of parents opting out of mandatory vaccination. Public Health England recently published their UK measles and rubella elimination strategy, which focuses on achieving and sustaining high coverage, 95% of coverage in the routine childhood programme of MMR, and achieving 95% coverage with 2 doses of MMR in older age groups through opportunistic and targeted catch-up. So finally, with regard to measles, it's important to remember that it's never too late to have MMR vaccine. There is no upper age limit. 2 doses are recommended for best protection, and these can be separated by 1 month over the age of 18 months. If an individual has an uncertain vaccine status, there's no harm in having additional doses. And it's particularly important to ensure groups like university freshers are protected. We need to ensure community or herd immunity to protect those who can't be immunized. So infants, pregnant women, and individuals with immunosuppression. And to do that, we have to have uptake of 95%, which is sustained over many years.
Thank you, Helen. I'm now going to talk about influenza. So you all know that influenza is primarily a respiratory illness, and traditionally we've been taught that it's the elderly and some at-risk groups who are particularly vulnerable to the disease and the complications. It's very much a seasonal disease, and so if you want to avoid it, spend the summer in the northern hemisphere and then go to the southern hemisphere and spend summer there. This is not available on the NHS, unfortunately. It takes the form of intermittent epidemics, and once every 20 to 30 years we have a pandemic when the disease spreads around the world, and we have a different epidemiology then as to who's infected. But I'm not going to talk about that now. I'm going to talk about what you might call routine seasonal influenza. Now, the at-risk groups are the elderly, and then almost anybody with a chronic disease condition. And as you can see, they're listed down here. More recently, morbid obesity has been added to the list, and of course pregnancy. And we also target people who are carers, because we don't want them to be sick or to be in a position to pass on the disease to their vulnerable clients. I put in brackets besides immunosuppression and relatives, not because they're susceptible to disease, but we really want to make sure that they are protected and so don't pass the disease on to their household contacts who are susceptible. It has been known for quite a while that young children are what are called super spreaders. They are very generous with their disease. If a toddler gets influenza, they do their best to pass it on to anybody they have in contact. They also have a significant morbidity themselves. And for these two reasons, it was decided by the JCVI to roll out an immunisation programme to all children between 2 and 16 years inclusive. This is a major undertaking, so it started off with just a few year cohorts being covered, and it's gradually being rolled out. It's kept under review, and it is possible that the original plan will be truncated to some extent, so that we only cover the 2s through to leaving primary school, but not the secondary school age. But watch this space. For quite a long time, it was felt that the inactivated vaccine, the traditional injected vaccine, was not very effective in children. And so it was only when an effective vaccine became available that this program was started. And this effective vaccine is the live attenuated nasal spray that we are now giving. This slide looks at how people with different risk factors are affected by the disease. So if we take the top line, this shows children who are not in an at-risk group. So they have a risk approximately 0.4 per 100,000 of the population of dying from a flu in a quote normal year. If somebody's in an at-risk group, otherwise not specified, they have 10 times the risk of dying. But more interestingly, when you look at the breakdown for the different diseases, the one we think of most commonly, chronic respiratory disease, the increased risk is about 6-fold. But that's nothing in comparison with people who have a chronic neurological disorder or who have chronic liver disease or immunosuppression. These people are at much greater risk as individuals, but of course they're a smaller part of the population. If we break this down by age, and first of all look at the risk of being admitted to hospital, this is overwhelmingly greatest in the preschool children. And as you can see from the first column, the risk of an under 6-monther ending up in hospital with flu is 333 per 100,000. Whereas at the other end of the age spectrum, the elderly, who, as I say, we classically consider at risk, it's about 1/10 of that. That risk falls off markedly after the age of 4. So the preschoolers are at greatest risk, it then falls and rises again in adulthood. Also of interest is when we look at what difference having a clinical risk factor makes, it has no effect on the preschoolers. It doesn't increase the risk at all. It's only again when we get into primary school and adulthood that this makes a difference. So that's looking at admissions. If we now look at deaths of those people who are admitted, we can see that actually deaths in young children are not that uncommon. And you can imagine that a ill child under 6 months, there will be a lower threshold to admit them, so they have less serious disease. But what is of note is if they do have a clinical risk factor, the risk of dying is considerably increased, something like 30-fold. Now, each year, WHO has to make a recommendation as to what strains of vaccine virus will go into the vaccine. And then this is adopted around the world. And they make this recommendation in February for people to start using the vaccine in September, October. With our current production methods, if they get that wrong, they cannot change it. And so sometimes we have a mismatch, and that's why the vaccine doesn't work. In most vaccines now, there will be 4 strains of vaccine virus. 2 strains of A, 2 strains of B, and for most years, one of those strains will change, which is one of the reasons why people need vaccinating year on year. From the point of view of children, the available vaccines are the nasal spray, which is an alive attenuated vaccine containing all 4 strains of virus, the traditional egg-based vaccine, which again has all 4 in, or newly licensed and will be newly used in the coming season, will be a cell culture-based quadrivalent inactivated vaccine. One of the things that has dogged the use of influenza vaccine, and I should remind you, influenza vaccines have been around for many, many decades, is the efficacy of the vaccine. And as I say, this partly depends upon whether or not the vaccine matches the circulating viruses, but also inherently the way that the virus is prepared on eggs means that it's not as effective as you might first think. These are the figures for last year showing the use of the live attenuated vaccine in the 2 to 17-year-old population. So the majority of those will be children who have no risk factors, between 2 and about 10 years old. And then the older children will be those who come from the population with risk factors. And as you can see, against the strain that bears closest resemblance to the last pandemic strain, the vaccine was effective in about 90% of cases. Whereas for the B strains, it was only 60%, and for the other A strain, it was down as minus 75%. Now, of course, that's a statistical anomaly. That was a strain that wasn't circulating very much. But the overall efficacy was at less than 30%. So one can understand why people ask, why should I bother? The answer, of course, is 30% is better than nothing. If we look at what happens in the older age ranges, the overall efficacy is even less. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of time and energy is being spent on finding new, more effective vaccines. To add to the controversy about effectiveness, for 2 years in a row, the Americans recommended positively against using the live attenuated vaccine because their studies had suggested, as we can see here in 2016, 17, the efficacy was only 3%, which is barely better than nothing. Whereas the efficacy of the inactivated vaccine that they were using was 63%. Now, why they should come up with such different figures from us, nobody knows. They've looked at the circulating strains, methods of preparation, etc., and there's no obvious explanation. And studies from some other European countries have been in keeping with the figures we have found. And now, in fact, the American recommendations are that one can use either the live vaccine or the inactivated vaccine. And of course, from the point of view of the child at the receiving end, it's nicer to have the live vaccine, which is a spray up your nose, rather than having a needle stuck in your arm. Another issue that crops up around influenza vaccines is egg allergy. Up until the coming season, almost all the vaccines were prepared on egg, and therefore, understandably, people were concerned about giving these vaccines to people who had previously shown an allergic reaction to egg. In fact, there is a lot of evidence that egg allergy per se, but short of egg anaphylaxis, was not a problem with influenza vaccines. The current advice is that if you have someone who's had egg anaphylaxis requiring intensive care, so really the very extreme end of the spectrum, should be referred for a further risk assessment, or in the coming season, one will be able to give the cell-based vaccine for children who are 9 years or older. Unfortunately, there's not a vaccine that's egg-free below that age. If a child is allergic to eggs but's not had an anaphylactic reaction, then the nasal spray is perfectly safe, or we can give them the low dose albumin content egg-based vaccine. In fact, there's emerging evidence that even children who've had an anaphylactic reaction to egg can probably be safely given any of the traditional flu vaccines. The uptake of flu vaccine is nothing like what we have for the other vaccines. Helen mentioned the uptake of MMR, which is running around 90%. The other vaccines are higher, whereas you can see from this slide that shows the uptake in the season 2017 in brackets, and then the main figures 2018. So relatively stable and around about the 60% mark for the younger school age children, but falling as they get older. Presumably they object more. And here we have the uptake in some at-risk groups, and this varies again by age. So if we look at the overall uptake of the vaccine in at-risk groups between 6 months and 65 years, it's only running at about 44%. In the 2-year-olds who are at risk, it's 50%, which is better than the 2-year-olds who are not at risk, but still a long way short of what we would want. 3-year-olds, it's a little bit higher. And I would remind you that we do give this vaccine to pregnant women, and the figures of only 43% are poor, because this is a lot lower than for the pertussis vaccine that's given during pregnancy. And then in the 65s and over, we run along at about 70%. So our at-risk population in childhood is well short of what we would like to see. So that's influenza vaccine. But there are also other vaccines that are either not part of the routine schedule, or we would want to give to children in addition to the routine schedule. And a lot of your population, the children that come to your clinics, will fall into this group because they have a chronic condition. And the most important vaccines in this context are the conjugate vaccines, flu vaccine, MMR, and the pneumococcal plain polysaccharide vaccine. So this is a table which is adapted from the PHE guidance showing chronic conditions and what extra vaccines or extra doses of vaccines they may need. And as you can see, for most this will be flu and the pneumococcal vaccine, but there will be other vaccines specifically for other conditions. So what is the importance of this? Well, we need to give these vaccines to those children, but we may need also to give some vaccines to household contacts of those children. So we need to be doubly certain that parents and siblings have had the MMR, because a immunosuppressed child, if they get measles, that's going to be bad news. And of course, we can't give them the MMR because they are immunosuppressed and it's a live vaccine. But there will be some children who are immunosuppressed, for example, whose household contact should get the chickenpox vaccine if they're not already immune, and a number of cases where flu vaccine to household contacts will be important. Why are paediatricians important in immunisations? Well, the children that you are seeing will often have a chronic disorder, and the parents will trust you to give advice about immunisations. And as we know from experience, unfortunately, parents of children with a chronic disorder do not go to their GP for routine care, and they miss out, and they are much less likely to be fully immunised. And in addition, children with a chronic disorder, the practice nurse or the GP may be wary about immunising because there are still myths about false contraindications. So what should paediatricians do? Well, when you see a child for the first time, ensure that they're up to date with their routine vaccinations. If they've missed out on vaccines, it's not too difficult to decide what they should have, or if necessary, one can refer to the PHE website, where there is an algorithm giving guidance for children of different ages. And then check that they don't need any extra vaccinations. And the default is almost, if they're seeing you, they probably do need something extra. And if at all possible, offer the vaccine when you see them, rather than sending them away to go elsewhere, because we know from experience that this is unlikely to happen. Sometimes people raise the issue that they can't be certain what a child has had and what would happen if they gave extra doses unnecessarily. Well, the answer to that question is the child will come to no harm, but if you don't give them the vaccines, then of course they run the risk of getting the diseases. All of this needs communicating to primary care and also putting in the child's red book so everybody knows what's going on. It's very helpful to anticipate concerns that primary care may raise, and I've already mentioned egg allergy, and children with epilepsy often primary care are worried about. And of course, the paediatrician should be offering advice to the parents and counselling them according to the particular needs that their child has.
Back to me now. So we have alluded to vaccine uptake figures, and I'm just going to show you where we are. These are annual figures for completed courses of uptake. So figures for the primary course at 12 months and MMR at MMR1 at 2 years are all over or nudging 95% in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. However, overall uptake is lower in the UK, and that's because it's brought down by England, in particular London, where historically vaccine uptake has always been lower for multiple reasons. The difference in uptake between the highest district for the primary vaccines at 12 months, which is South Tyneside, and the lowest uptake, which is City and Hackney in London, is 22%. So what do we know about children who are not fully immunised at 2 years? Well, basically they fall into two broad groups. These are children who didn't complete an immunisation course, so they're partially immunised. They may have had 1 or 2 doses, but they haven't completed all 3. And they're often socially and economically disadvantaged, or they may have failed to complete the course simply for difficulties with access or practical or logistic reasons. And then there are parents who reject immunisation, and about 2 or 3% reject all vaccines, but they may cluster in geographically. Some other parents may reject specific vaccines. This figure of about 2 or 3% hasn't really changed for many decades, so the idea that there are many more parents rejecting all vaccines doesn't seem to be backed up by the evidence. And these are often parents who make a conscious decision which is based on fear or mistrust of vaccines, or who don't consider them to be necessary. So which children are at low risk of low vaccine uptake? Well, there are groups who have difficulty accessing services. These include looked after children, including unaccompanied asylum seekers, travellers and gypsies. Younger children in large families are less likely to be fully immunised, and this is probably because of the practicalities of just busy family life, when immunisation, with the best will in the world, isn't always top of the list of priorities. And the same applies for lone parents and teenage mothers. Children admitted to hospital who are premature or low birth weight and have chronic disabling conditions are all at risk of low vaccine uptake. And these are obviously a group that paediatricians come in contact with often, and those obviously not registered with a GP. And then some ethnic minority groups tend to have lower uptake. So, for example, the Black British Somali groups tend to have lower uptake than the Asian populations, who have much higher uptake than the white population. So when we're considering talking to parents, we need to understand that parents have a differing need for information based on their position on immunisation. So the important thing to remember is that most children are fully immunised, and most parents are confident in vaccines and have their children vaccinated automatically, but may have some minor concerns or even some major concerns. Only about 2% decline all vaccines. So in discussing with parents, it is important to understand where they're coming from, what their position is, as this will help determine their information needs. Parents' questions and concerns about vaccines are predictable, which means that we can be well equipped with how to respond to these questions. So things like vaccine safety will always be top of the list, or the diseases have disappeared, so why do we still need to vaccinate? And then issues about the age of vaccination, what additives are contained in vaccines, and of course concerns which continue about the possibility that MMR is associated with autism. So talking with parents about vaccines can be challenging and uncomfortable sometimes in view of the misinformation that's widely available, but it is a very important thing to do. And it's also important to ensure that parents who decline immunisation or are talking about declining it are offered an opportunity to discuss their questions. But there is currently a lack of evidence about effective interventions to reduce parental vaccine refusal. So we really need to be focusing on those parents who are on the fence, who are undecided or hesitant about vaccination, particularly as this group may be vulnerable to the misinformation from social media and other sources. It is important to remember that many parents who have previously declined or delayed vaccines change their mind after a conversation with a health professional. So it's a very powerful thing to do, and it is important. So next we're going to consider some of the principles of having this conversation with parents. And it's important to use phrasing that assumes immunisation will occur so that it's the default. And this makes a very clear, confident signal to the parent that vaccination is your recommendation. First, it's important to establish empathy and trust. And this can be done by clarifying that you know you're concerned, that the parent knows you're concerned about the best interests of their children just as they are. Inviting questions is useful and asking permission to discuss. So things like, I've looked into this a lot. Would it be okay if I share with you what I found out? You need to establish and be respectful of any specific concerns. There's such a lot of information out there. This all can be very confusing. But it's important to be aware that restating myths may reinforce the myths. Understanding what information the parents have already accessed is very important, as it gives you a starting point. Briefly address any concerns tailored to the concerns, but remember that just giving more and more information may not be the answer. Less is more. And it's important to focus on disease risk. So try and take the conversation away from myths about the vaccine and focus on the disease. So, for example, measles is a potentially serious disease. Focus on the fact that vaccines are safe and effective, and importantly, recommend immunisation. It may be useful to share your own personal experience of vaccinating your own children if the parent inquires about that. So face-to-face conversations are better for parents who have major concerns and questions, but it is important to remember that nobody knows everything about vaccination, so you need to know when and where to refer for further information. The important thing is that if parents are still not ready to vaccinate, ensure you leave the door open so that they can revisit it at a later time. This is generally not the way to do it. Of course, this is a joke, but using strong persuasion or saying this is what you should do is not going to encourage parents to trust what you're saying. So don't argue or confront them or belittle their concerns, because their concerns are genuine and need to be taken seriously. There are many sources of information available to support your conversations with parents. So, for example, on the Public Health England website, there is a lot of information. The Green Book is obviously the first port of call for any questions about vaccination, and lots of information about new vaccines with leaflets, training, slide sets and guidance is on this website. Vaccine Update is a very useful publication which you can sign up to and comes into your email box with the latest information about immunisation and changes to the schedule, those kind of issues. Other sources of information that are very useful, I've already mentioned the Vaccine Knowledge Project, which is produced by the Oxford Vaccine Group, and this is a very, very useful website indeed, with a wealth of information, particularly some of the responses to parents' questions. And equally, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia Vaccine Education Center is a really useful resource, although bear in mind, of course, it's focused on the American schedule. So finally, vaccination is proven highly effective and has a good safety record. But in this era where we have little disease, parents may tend to focus on the potential harms of vaccines rather than the diseases, as they have no experience of them. Anti-vaccine sentiment on social media is very loud, but it doesn't represent the majority view among parents. We must bear that in mind. Paediatricians and child health professionals have an important role in advising parents and primary care about immunisation. And paediatricians and child health professionals should have an important role also in public advocacy for vaccination.
So that's concluded our presentation for today. Thank you very much to Helen and David for a really informative and clear talk. We're now open to the Q&A session. So as a reminder to those of you that joined late, if you'd like to ask any questions of our speakers, please use the questions tab on your GoToWebinar software to type in a question. Please do make it clear the question you're asking so that we can get your question posed correctly. So just give people a couple of minutes to submit a question, and then we'll start the Q&A session. So the first question that we've had in thanks the speakers for their invaluable talk, and states, regarding egg allergy and flu vaccine, can we say that it's a very new update to decide on change to low dose or cell-based, that we used to still offer egg-based but in emergency facilitated conditions? So I'll hand that over to the speakers.
Thank you. It's David. I'll answer that one. Well, I didn't need to tell you it was David, really. So thanks for your thanks. The recommendation to use a low dose albumin containing flu vaccine in children with egg allergy has been in place many years now. The live attenuated vaccine, the one that we give as a nasal spray, is low dose, so that's not really an issue. The cell-based vaccine was only licensed, I think, in December or January, so hasn't been used this season and will be coming in next season. So that is a very new bit of advice. And for a child who has egg allergy, not anaphylaxis, that does not need to do in an emergency facilitated conditions, because anybody who's immunizing, in fact anybody who's giving any medication, really ought to have the capacity to treat an anaphylactic reaction. So I hope that's answered your question.
Thank you very much. The next questions come in. How much of a growing threat is anti-vax material on social media?
The increase of anti-vax vaccine material on social media is a concern, but we must remember that this is a minority view, and recent research has shown that it's actually a very small body of people that are posting a vast amount of material. It is challenging to know how to deal with this, but I'm firmly of the view that health professionals are the best approach to answering parents' questions. So we need to be sure that health professionals are equipped to respond to the material that's available.
Thank you. Our next question is, do you think that state involvement is constructive? For example, the intervention in a couple of countries, for example, France and Australia, that proof of immunisation must be provided before school admission.
Personally, I feel that legislation would not be appropriate in this country. As we've seen from our vaccine uptake figures, they are very high, and that's based on recommendation rather than the law. There is room for improvement, yes, but legislation can backfire, and what it might do is make people who are hesitant more resistant. It wouldn't have any impact on people who are very opposed to vaccination. And because you always have to have opt-out clauses, as they do in the United States, people will always find a way out. So, for example, in the States, there are vast numbers of children being homeschooled. Some of this is to avoid that kind of legislation. So I think that this would be counterproductive in this country, and I actually believe that some countries have brought in legislation as a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, but it'll be interesting to see what happens because this is all very recent.
I just want to add that I agree entirely with Helen. When you introduce compulsion with sanctions to it, you may in fact be doing things that you wouldn't want to do, like increasing the numbers of children who are home educated, or if you introduce fines, the people that can pay will pay them, and it will be the people who are more disadvantaged that will be even more disadvantaged. So I think we ought to rely on the ability to talk to individuals and persuade rather than coercion.
Thank you. We'll take another question. How would you respond to the mother who already has one child with autism, and the next child is due to have their 1-year-old MMR?
I think you would use the same principles that Helen has mentioned earlier, that it is no surprise that such a parent would be worried. But one would then have to sit down, and this takes time. It's not something you can do in a 5-minute consultation, but go through with them the evidence that in general there is no link between MMR and autism. But there have also been studies that have looked specifically at what happens if you already have a child in the family who's autistic. Does that in any way change that conclusion so that those children who subsequently follow in that family are going to be more at risk? And there is good hard evidence that those children are not at risk of developing autism. So the bottom line would be to reassure, but that will take time. And it will take understanding as well, because Helen showed you all the headlines that there were back in 2002-03, and so it's no surprise that people are concerned.
Thank you. We have another question. There is some evidence to suggest that the antenatal period may be the most opportune time to address any parental vaccination hesitancy to change perception. What are the speakers' views, and have you any targeted strategies around this?
Yes, I would agree that this is a very opportune time to start talking to parents about vaccination, particularly because we have the vaccine in pregnancy programme. So pregnant women are offered flu vaccine and whooping cough vaccine. So this offers an important opportunity to also start talking about infant vaccination. And I think the targeted strategy would be just to start the conversation then and offer the vaccine for the mother, but talk about the fact that when the baby's born, the baby can also have their own protection.
I think Helen is right, of course, that one needs to start the conversation before parents come to the clinic. The difficulty with pregnancy is, of course, women are being overloaded with information. So that would be the starting point, and then it would need to be reinforced. For example, when the health visitor does her first visit at 14 days and then subsequently. So it's an ongoing process. It's not one time giving the information.
Thank you. Our next question is, can you explain the reasons for the great variety in influenza vaccine for children? Public health approach in Western countries, where most of European countries keep influenza vaccine for at-risk children only.
I think part of the explanation is who is the target audience, or who are the target people you are trying to protect. There is evidence from the campaigns that have been run in this country of immunising children in primary school, that has a knock-on effect in terms of influenza in the general population. And this, as I said earlier on, is one of the reasons why we give the flu vaccine to children, to protect other vulnerable members of the community. Now, I think that other countries may not have quite the same approach. As you possibly have implied in America they have the same approach, and in fact they recommend flu immunisation for everybody. I think what will possibly happen in this country is we'll continue the flu vaccination programme as is, with children in primary school and preschool being done, both because they are protected, but also the rest of the population. And we may have a second think about whether we should roll this out to secondary school, because it doesn't have quite the same effect on the general population.
Thank you. We have a question again to do with the anti-vaccines. So should health professionals use social media to get the truth out about vaccines, for example, to try to counteract the vast amounts of material put up by a small number of anti-vaxxers?
I think it's very important that we actually employ some of the tactics that anti-vaccine activists are using. So yes, I think it's very important to get powerful messages out about how effective and safe vaccines are. You do have to have a bit of a stomach for this, because if you're going to counter all the anti-vaccine material that comes up, it's a full-time job. But I certainly think that we do have an important role in putting out positive messages as much as we can.
I think we undoubtedly have a role, but I think it was Michelle Obama who said, they go low, we go high. So yes, we should respond, but we shouldn't respond in the same terms. And frankly, I'm quite disgusted at some of the language that's used by, quotes, both sides of the debate. I don't think this helps at all. One of the difficulties with some parts of social media is that the number of words you can use is very limited, so having a sensible discussion is not helpful. I think Mumsnet moderate their website now and aim people at vaccine information when the question arises, and I think this is probably a good compromise, so that one isn't putting people down, but one is offering an alternative view, and I think that's the way to go.
Thank you. We have a question around rubella. Rubella is only serious if you are pregnant, so why give the vaccine to young boys?
So rubella or German measles is indeed a very mild disease. Often nothing more than a fleeting rash appears. The problem with rubella is if a woman catches it in the first 3 months of pregnancy, there's a very high risk that the baby will be damaged, multiply damaged. We used to have a policy where schoolgirls and susceptible adult women were offered rubella vaccine in an effort to protect themselves against infection with rubella in pregnancy. And this worked quite successfully, but wasn't wholly successful, because most rubella disease occurs in young children. So women who hadn't been immunized were still susceptible, and we still saw cases of so-called congenital rubella infection. By immunizing young boys and girls, you create herd immunity, and women are protected in that way, and this has been extremely successful. We have very, very few cases of congenital rubella now, only about 1 a year, in fact, and they're often among women who've been born abroad in countries where they don't have effective vaccination policies. Yes, indeed. The coverage rates have been dropping slightly. It's about the order of 1 or 2%. It is a concern. It's not quite clear what the cause is. There's no reason to suspect that fewer parents are having their children immunized. So it is a concern. Whatever the reason, it is a concern. And we certainly need to keep our eye on this and do everything we can to improve uptake.
So one final question that we have before we close the Q&A session is, why are we giving flu vaccine to healthy children?
As mentioned earlier, there are 2 reasons for giving flu vaccine to children. One is to protect them, and as we've seen from the figures, children of preschool age have quite a high rate of hospital admission with flu, but the other is to stop them being a source for more susceptible members of the population. And there is good evidence that when you immunise primary school age children and preschool children, it does reduce the amount of flu in the general population, and particularly the elderly who are susceptible.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions that we're having in from the audience today. So I think that concludes our webinar. Thank you once again to Helen and David for a really informative presentation and for answering the range of questions that have come through from the audience. For those of you who would like to view the webinar again, we are recording it and it will be made available on the college's campus website in about a week's time. That is available to people who are both members and non-members of the college. So if you have colleagues who are not members who are in other professions, they're welcome to access the webinar. And if you found this webinar useful, we have a range of other different webinars also available on the campus website from previous live sessions. So do please use the second link on your screens to access those. And we would also find it useful if you could provide feedback on today's webinar through the top link available on your screen. But that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.